First of all, I'd like to thank all four speakers for keeping to approximately 10 minutes, which isn't always the case, which leaves us with about half an hour for questions. I found that interesting, surprisingly optimistic, I think, and based on some straightforward implementation of successful lessons that have been learned, presumably backed by political commitment. So I'd be interested to see what sort of responses we get. So I'll open it to questions now, and if I could take them in groups, I think, because there's a number of people. So if people could raise their hands, and I can clearly identify them. Yes, gentleman at the front. And if you could identify yourself and whether it's generally for the panel or particular speakers.
Hello, thank you. Is that working? My name is Phil Vernon. I work for International Alert. It's a London-based charity. And I was also surprised by the heavy dose of optimism, which I don't actually share. And I think, to go back to, I think when you introduced the subject, you said there's two questions here. One is it a mission impossible? And secondly, is it the right mission? And my view is it's not actually framed in the right way at all. And the MDGs are actually, while they are great as aspirational, inspirational galvanizers, they are not the right things for which the international institutions and local institutions of development ought to be held accountable. I think what's missing from the MDGs is the narrative about how progress actually takes place in human society. And I think the food is a good example to give. There are many of the problem. There's a humanitarian need to feed people. People who are hungry ought to be fed. That's just a given. That's a moral, ethical issue. A society which allows it, society in which people go hungry is not, it seems to me, a fully developed society, if you take an idea of development. But that doesn't mean that feeding people is the way to get to the place where you need to be in order for a society to be caring about its people and able to feed its people. And I think the kind of whole issue of theories of change is what's perhaps a bit missing. Even talking about gender, I completely agree with the need for all the things you mentioned, but to move from a society in which gender relations are, according to my values, imperfect, towards a society in which they are better, according to, I think, the values you espouse, is a big challenge to bite off, and it's not captured by the MDGs at all. So I think the MDGs are actually possibly perverse in their incentivization of not just aid money and aid activities, but other activities which enable aid. The last thing I would say is if you look at the Millennium Declaration, the wording which that uses before the MDGs came in to talk about development is something about creating an enabling environment for human progress, for progress. It's not about welfare. It's about creating an environment in which people can improve. It's not lifting people out of poverty. It's people sort of rising out of poverty in circumstances which let them do that. So it's political rather than technical.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, gentleman in the peppermint shirt. If you could try and get the microphone across, then. Thank you.
My name is Eugene Kulas. I come from an organization called the Voice of Dalit International. I have a question to ODI itself. As far as 1999, before the MDGs were coined, you say that our mission statement, our new mission statement, so that means you must have had an old mission statement earlier. It says that to inspire and inform policy and practice which lead to the reduction of poverty, the alleviation of suffering, and the achievement of sustainable livelihood. Has ODA been loyal to this statement, or why did ODA give some policies by which MDGs were not achieved? It looks like, these things are only on paper. The policies are not addressing to the real poverty of people. A comment about our lady from United Nations. You say that there are 1 billion global poor are there, plus 1 billion plus global poor are there. Do you have any category, or have you categorized them to address their poverty, or simply you are throwing out money to all the global poor? Let me draw your attention. On the 6th of April, this government UK has passed a bill, single equality bill, in which they have included caste discrimination illegal in UK. And if it says caste cause poverty. And let me read a little thing. It caste cause poverty and gets in the way of poverty reduction. Caste causes poverty of a particular people, leading to high rate of poverty among the affected group. It reduces the productive capacity and poverty reduction of a society as a whole. You know, in India alone, 1/3 of the global poor are poor because of this caste cause poverty. Do you have United Nations and other organizations working in 150 or 200 or 500 countries? Do we have a strategy for this? Without this, how can you reduce poverty of the global poor?
Okay,
so
thank you.
We are treating the symptoms, but not the cause.
Great. Okay, I'd like to gentleman at the back with his hand up. The yellow shirt.
My name is Wolfgang Deckert. And if there's the question for the whole panel, if I understand you correctly, then market forces are useless, right? As a matter of fact, they're destructive. And that means, and that's my question, is the IMF policies and World Bank policies, are they wrong?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll let the panel come back and then I'll try and take another round of questions. So, who wants to, perhaps we'll start at the far end, Rebecca.
Okay.
And if I could ask you, sorry, to keep your answers as short as possible, then we can collect as many questions as possible. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll leave some of the questions then to my colleagues, but I did just want to pick up on the issue around politics and around theories of change, about drivers of change, and I think we do end up there's a tension between sort of short-term fixes and long-term addressing structural inequality, and I think these kind of things are really important to recognise. And in terms of gender equality, in my presentation, what I was trying to show is that there are some really simple, practical programming tools which can lead to quick wins in terms of just thinking about these kind of design interests, but actually, if you want to, the commitment to actually get those in place in terms of financial commitment, political commitment, takes a lot longer and is much more difficult and complex process to try and actually address and tackle those inequalities, those structural inequalities which lead to the reaction that we don't have such. Why don't we have those practical quick wins as well?
Thank you. David?
A series of good questions and comments. I agree strongly with the point that the issues are political in as much technical. But when you start dealing with politics, you start dealing with power, and it seems at times difficult to make traction. I think in some ways the MDGs can be, they're what we have to work with for the moment. They might be a sticking point to where we can make noise and divert the attention now. It's reframe the debate that we failed to reach them, not because of the technical issues, not because of the money, but because of these underlying deeper issues grounded in the way the policies we're choosing, the way we're building societies, perhaps in unhealthy ways that are plunging people back into poverty. So I agree with you that the targets perhaps weren't ideal, and hope that you'll try to step into the debates and think about post-MDGs, how can we influence them to give low-income countries ownership of them. The second point about poverty, hugely important, one that's not just about India, but also where I'm from in the United States. I'm from Texas originally, and the black-white divide there is a particularly important basis of inequality that's impeded the development of redistributive systems and protections.
1/3 of the global poor. Poverty is everywhere. But if you can have specific programs to address 1/3 of the global poor in South Asia, you can reduce the poverty and you achieve the Millennium Development Goal. Why are you simply wasting your energy?
I'm not sure I'm entirely following. What is it you're recommending there?
You have 1 billion people under poverty and you want to reduce the poverty. When you ignore 1/3 of the global poor and address only 2/3 of the global poor, with all your effort, can you ever reduce the poverty to half? This one side is always isolated. Always this big chunk is there without addressing specifically how are you going to reduce the poverty. That's the thing. And another thing is there are symptoms of poverty. These 8 Millennium Goals are symptoms of poverty. Where is your policy to address the cause of the poverty?
Okay. do you want to come in, Caroline?
Yes, I mean, first of all, when I mentioned the 1 billion figure, I meant Hungary, not poor. I mean, obviously the one is similar to the other because the hungry people aren't necessarily poor. But as far as the World Food Programme is concerned, we are trying to feed just 1/10 of those who actually need our assistance. Now, we have the biggest budget, I believe, of any humanitarian organisation, and we are struggling to reach that budget. Last year, it was nearly 6 billion. We got 4-point-something billion. I mean, we simply can't do it without assistance from the world's governments, from corporate donors, from individuals. We actually, this is a little known fact, but the World Food Programme is entirely voluntarily funded. So everything that we do, every cent that we spend, is spent very carefully on programs to reduce hunger and poverty. And I'm sorry, we know it's not enough. It's 1/10, it's a drop in the ocean. But at least for 1/10 of the world's hungry, we are trying to eliminate and reduce their hunger.
Policies that
Okay, sir, sorry, I'm going to give the panellists a chance to respond. Yeah.
Thank you, David. It's fascinating, and I enjoyed many of the interventions of my colleagues on the panel and some of the questions. And I think 2 points I want to make in response to that. One is, I guess, are they the right mission, MDGs? And the question of, I mean, on a personal note, myself, I wrote an article some years ago criticising MDGs for certain flaws in there, not least because if you go back to pre-MDGs, you talked about the Millennium Declaration, but go back to before that, the study that the UN commissioned at that time was the Voices of the Poor. And you read that, and that study is about the insides of human change. It's about how individuals, human beings behave, about how societies behave. It's about dignity, about hope, about things that are less tangible than we see in the Millennium Development Goals. Things about equality, including caste. It's about those things. And the Millennium Development Goals absolutely did not recognise how societies change, how individuals change. So I, on a personal note, I completely understand those challenges. However, the second point I want to make relates to the optimism. I think any of us probably in this endeavour, optimism is a prerequisite for carrying on, getting up and out of bed in the morning and going to work and trying to make a difference. I think optimism is a prerequisite for that, as well as compassion. And I think if you have those two things, you don't want to check your brain out and leave it at the door. And I believe a lot of the critical things, and if I was working in a university setting, I would be saying some of the same things as David here. But you cannot do that. You need to do that intelligently. But I do think we have to be optimistic when, for example, this government that we currently have in the UK here has ring-fenced two things only that it won't cut spending on. One of that is international aid. I don't know about you, but not many people would have necessarily thought that of a Conservative government in this country if you were growing up under Margaret Thatcher's Britain, as I was as a young man. So there are some reasons for optimism, and I think although it's a blunt instrument, a flawed instrument, thank God we have something, because in the middle of a global financial crisis, how on earth can we keep attention on what's a far bigger global crisis? And I think that the fact that there is still attention on this today here, journals, academic journals, international conferences, world leaders turning up at things, is a cause for optimism amidst, of course, a lot of challenges. So I will continue to try and remain an optimist, and when I lose that, I'm going to be looking to do something else, I think.
Okay, I'll take another round of questions. If I take the lady here.
My name is Jenny Watt, and I've worked in the past with the UN and here at the University of Class. My question is, can any of the panelists, do any of the panelists think that governments have actually changed the way they work because of the MDGs? And in particular, not so much the donor countries, but the support countries.
Thank you. Yes, guy there at the end in the blue T-shirt.
Hi. My name's Leo Williams. I work for BOND, the UK network organisation for NGOs working in international development. Simple question of the panellists. Just wondering what they think UK civil society could or should do to promote a positive outcome from the MDG summit this September.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and the gentleman there as well, just in front there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to the panellists. My name's John. I work for a corporate responsibility charity called Business in the Community, and you've given lots of ideas on kind of keeping up pressure on government, on kind of linkages between government departments and ministries, and lots of kind of different ideas. But I'm just wondering, what does the panel think is the role of the private sector in achieving the MDGs?
Okay, and I will add one question onto that. By the magic of modern technology, this event's being streamed live, so we're getting questions through, which I'm struggling to multitask. But I will add this question on from Lulu Thapa from King's College, just down the road. How serious are the developed countries in achieving the MDGs by 2015 as well? So 4 questions for the panel, and perhaps if we start at this end with Justin this time.
Okay, there's a whole smorgasbord of wonderful questions to pick there, all of them quite difficult actually. Let me pick, I'm sorry I didn't quite catch your name up there, but have governments changed the way they work in response to MDGs, particularly in the South? And a very short answer would say yes, but not enough. In my opinion, I guess you had the whole realm of poverty reduction strategy and more integration of poverty reduction planning and sector-wide approaches, things which was supported by donors and international community, but also have, I would say, a more coherence in some countries in their poverty, in their approach to poverty. In some countries, in some places where governance is good and economic conditions are, there's a following wind there. That has happened to some extent. Where the right leadership has been in place, I think you have seen that. MDGs have been a factor in that, but I wouldn't say they have been the primary factor in that. I think the conditions, the enabling environment, which I think someone spoke about earlier, those enabling environment are mostly local rather than global, I think, for many of those factors. But some of those, I'm going to leave it just to that question. Okay. So I'll give them some
well, in that case, I'll take the next one. NGOs, what could civil society do to promote the MDGs? I don't know whether anybody else was at an excellent, I would say that, UNA UK forum. Yes, I know you were. At the weekend. It was a really impressive show of panels, speakers, etc. And I think what was really inspired me, I suppose, most was the fact that the age range was right across the board, right from quite sort of young students right through to sort of Baroness Shirley Williams age and older. People who were really, really intent on seeing basically a stronger UN, which of course is music to our ears in the UN, though I don't necessarily want to defend all our fellow agencies. I felt then that this is civil society actually beginning to work. People actually were interested and wanting to see what I believe was the MDGs come about. And obviously they're imperfect, but they're a force for good. I think that's just something that I wanted to add.
Another set of good questions. I want to go back to one about the IMF and World Bank and market forces, which links in to the private role of the private sector question. Pre-MDGs, there were a couple important reports about structural adjustment with a human face from UNICEF and the Voices of the Poor report that was just mentioned, that focused on how a neoliberal model of development focusing on privatization, liberalization, stabilization made some mistakes and led to decades of underinvestment in countries and pushed hard on austerity in the middle of a financial crisis, led countries racked with debt, and today even more money is flowing out of countries from debt repayments, capital flight, than flows in through aid. So I don't want to say that the market model is completely wrong. There are examples, there are instances where markets work extremely well. Maybe cans of tuna, that's questionable with regard to overfishing. But healthcare and many of the issues embedded in MDGs, markets don't seem to be working for, which is why we have them. the critique about the MDGs is that they're a way of trying to fix some of those market shortcomings while preserving the dominant model. I think some of the points we've heard are beginning to question the dominant economic model that got us in this mess and question whether Band-Aids embedded in the MDGs are enough. In terms of governments changing behavior, I can point in health to some adverse changes to where many governments in Latin America, health ministers are aware that what's killing their populations and people in poverty is not HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis so much, but things that are not so sexy. Heart disease, diabetes, chronic diseases, cancers, what we die from. And when you ask these health ministers, what are you doing about it? They'll say, well, not much. When we talk to donors, it's not on the menu, it's not on the list, there's no funding, there's no will. So they don't raise these issues to the global community. It's created a bit of a gridlock and omitted a lot of important diseases of what's killing people off the table. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Just briefly, just take the questions about governments changing the way they work and also how serious are developed countries. And I just wanted to come back to some examples actually around social protection and around the increased commitment to social protection. Some of that has been, in part, having the MDGs there, particularly on education. There's been a strong focus from a number of countries on scholarships and education scholarships. And these are highly supported by donors, but implemented through national governments in terms of at the school level. And I think that's quite a good example of commitment. Also, the PSMP in Ethiopia, which I was mentioning, is a government and donor partnership in which a huge amount of investments have gone there to think about innovative ways to address poverty and vulnerability, particularly in Ethiopia in response to years and years of food crisis, a more sustainable approach. I'm not necessarily linking that to the MDGs, but there are some examples of positive, innovative programs. But I think an important thing to mention as well is that in many countries, for example in sub-Saharan Africa, social protection is still very tiny. I mean, it's only reaching 4% of the poorest households, and even in that, it's targeting poorest households who have no labour, so perhaps like the elderly or children, but actually also not addressing the poor who have labour, but are poor for a reason that they can't get jobs. And so there's some often skewed targeting bias, which we really need to address in terms of looking at what is poverty and vulnerability and how can social protection programs as well as other development programs address those rather than being instrument driven.
Okay, and well, the commitment, the seriousness of donors, perhaps we could take it in the second one. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to finish on time, so I'll just take one or two more questions. Yeah, guy there with the waistcoat on.
Hello, thank you very much for your interesting talk. My name is Abdi Ghavami. I lecture at London Metropolitan University in food and nutrition. My question, two quick questions are, first of all to the panel, these are very serious global issues. However, it's a long time since I've seen it in the broadsheets or the papers in the UK. Why do you think this is so, or what can we do more to encourage this to be reported to the wider members of the public? The second part to my question is for Caroline Hurford. You mentioned about food fortification and micronutrient supplementation. What are WFP's thoughts on locally sourced foods and the development of their production in those communities affected by malnutrition or undernutrition? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One last question, right at the back there.
Hi, thanks to the panelists. My name is Carmen Ho. I'm a graduate student at UCL. I think my question actually touches on the previous one, and it's specifically for Caroline Hurford. You talked about the first MDG and the UN's role in addressing chronic hunger. But even with that target, the number of people facing chronic hunger has been on the rise for the past 15 years. And that is even without the food crisis and even without the global economic crisis. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on why this is.
Okay, thank you. So, 2 questions and any final thoughts you may have.
Well, if I can just make a start with the guy from the Metropolitan University. I agree that hunger is indeed a very serious global issue. Why isn't it reported more in the newspapers? I wish I could encourage more journalists to write about it. I do think, nevertheless, that, as I think I said in my address, that food and what we eat, and we are what we eat and all that, does seem to have gained a certain amount of traction in the press. I certainly noted in the Guardian, for instance. Maybe that's just because they're more likely to write about this kind of thing. I feel that it is generally better written about in Europe, perhaps. I think there's a greater understanding, possibly, and maybe I'm not doing a good enough job here in UK. On the matter of the micronutrients and local sourcing, yes, indeed, WFP does try, where possible, to use its cash donations to buy food locally, because obviously this is much cheaper. It means that we can help local farmers. We have a program called Purchase for Progress, or P4P, whereby we help the smallholder farmers and connect them to markets. But also, when it comes to the micronutrient side of it, this is a very exciting area because, as you'll probably be aware, there's a product called Plumpy Dose or Plumpy Nut, which is very expensive. It's set up by Nutriset, a company in France, and it's basically a sort of peanut butter paste type thing. And it's wonderful because without it being like our corn soya blend, mothers can just sort of rip off the edge of the sachet and just feed it into the children's mouths. They don't have to go into these treatment centres and things. They can be treated at home, and it's absolute wonder food. It's very expensive though. So what we've been doing is we've been going around to people like in Ethiopia. They've got chickpea. We've developed a kind of chickpea mush. We haven't got a better name for it. Anybody please help us to find a good name. But essentially, this is the kind of thing that's really taking off now. And after the floods in the Philippines, for instance, apparently Josette Sheeran, our executive director, got the entire cabinet sitting around trying this chickpea mush. And they said, yes, but can't we do it with coconut? And she said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And so this is obviously something which is going to be taking off. But most of our purchases are indeed in sub-Saharan Africa, wherever we can. On the, I think it was the lady at the back who was asking about why the numbers of the hungry have gone up. I think it's obviously we've got to think, we have to say it very carefully, we've cut the proportion of hungry between, I think it was 1969 and 2004, but the overall numbers have gone up simply because of the population explosion. Which, that's a whole other matter and an elephant in the room and all the rest of it, and I don't want to go there. But why have the numbers of hungry gone up? I think it's simply because there is insufficient amount of food available in those countries where families are very large, and because you see things happening like in Ethiopia where farms are divided and there's the leaching of the soil, and there are all sorts of other complex arguments which I would really rather leave to my FAO colleagues. Okay, over to somebody else.
Excuse me, hunger in countries are going up not because of scarcity of food. In my country, India, plenty of food, but people are not allowed to eat. Yep. Because they are restrained from eating and drinking and having house and having education and employment and all those kind of things. Okay. This is the point where it is, if money is given, everybody can administer the money.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I will just pick up on the question about the public. I think that's a fundamentally important question for us here in the UK, in every country, rich and poor. It pains me to know that during an election campaign, if you look at surveys that DFID and others do, surveys of public opinion on things, that international poverty and development never features high on that. But yet at the same time, when you have an event like the earthquake in Haiti, you see our capacity to empathise and to respond in a time of need. But it seems to take either ridiculously bad news, to prompt that response, or unless you go down the line of things like comic relief and things which try to combine that with something else. We all need to do a much better job of connecting the experiences of people like Queen, who we heard from, with the experiences of our own day-to-day lives. We need to get that. we are the globalized world is a smaller world. Whether live streaming here, I don't think anyone in Nairobi or in somewhere else would be foolish enough to live stream watch this. They're probably live stream watching the World Cup or something. But we should find ways to connect better with the technology we have, with the human stories that we come into contact with. And certainly in World Vision, that's one of the things we want to do more in the next few years. But I think we all have a part to play in that. Whether it's when I say goodnight to my kids at bed to remind them that actually they're lucky that they got that meal rather than in that, or whether it's whatever social network you're in, whether it be virtual online or whether it be friends down the pub, make this a part of your conversations. Don't leave it to lecture theatres like this.
David, Rebecca, any last thoughts to add?
No, I'm happy for...
Okay.
Keep it
You have the privilege.
Oh, well, the big task here. Change to a great extent starts with us, and it's very easy to point to other groups and what they can do better, but we've got a needle or a log in our own eye. Organizationally, it's very difficult to change the patterns that have been set in motion, aid agencies, groups that continue to do business the way that they have. Crisis, broadly defined, is that we're not reaching the MDGs. We've been set back by the financial crisis. We've been set back by the food crisis. You here in the room can come up with new models for change. One has recently come out with the World Health Organization Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, which speak to a lot of the messages that we've heard. Good food, good housing, safe environments. But we lack a social movement that can drive that agenda forward. Donors are being driven by where people are going to put their money to, and those are pictures of emaciated children. But the pictures of emaciated children are changing. Now we have children who are morbidly obese, general problems of poor nutrition. So the scales have tipped from undernutrition, and they're now moving to overnutrition. Hardly a development. I would encourage you to try to rise up to focus on these social and economic determinants, ones associated with the way we're building societies that are going against every dollar we put in to try to fix it.
Thank you, David, for a rousing finish. I think you'll agree. Just a few final words. Chickpea mush. Hummus? I'll patent that. But seriously, just final words. I'd like to say thank you very much for the organisers. You saw a few of them wandering around with Mike's mark at the beginning, but there's many others that were involved in it. So thank you to everyone who put in an awful lot of effort. Thank you to the ODI and SPP as well, School of Public Policy, for helping co-sponsor this. Thank you to all of you for coming, asking questions. Those of you who didn't get to ask your questions or would like to follow up, there will be a drinks reception over the road in the main building of UCL. So if you go across the quad, I'm sure there'll be lots of volunteers between here and there showing you the way, and you can address your questions to the panel. But finally, just leaves me to thank the panel very much for giving them their time, giving us their time and their thoughts. So thank you.